Well, let us pray together. O Lord, I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts together this morning, whether we're in this space now or whether we're connected wherever we're scattered, the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts would be honorable and pleasing in your sight, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Well, we are 6 months now into this global pandemic, and think about how much has changed since March and how fast things have changed. We did a staff retreat last week, and we debrief the whole past year, and it feels like we can't even remember what happened before March. I mean, that just feels like 5 years ago. But so much has happened in the last 6 months since COVID hit. And one of the things that's hard still is that I think we're still not sure exactly how long we're going to be in this, what it's going to look like on the other side. Maybe summer has brought a bit of normalcy to you and to your family, but I know that now we're gearing up for school. My wife teaches in Sheldon, and the teachers went back last week. I think Sioux Center, the same thing, and they start school on Monday. I know others are maybe a little bit later. Kids, I think, are excited, and teachers are excited and nervous, and I think same thing with college, right? I mean, it's fun to see some of our RDs back, and I know to get to interact with some of you from Northwestern and Dordt this morning. We're not sure exactly what's ahead. And I was talking with my spiritual director a couple of weeks ago, and we were just talking about how this is such an uncertain time, and if this is like not just a couple months, but are we looking at even something longer than that? All the pressure and challenges, and I'm not sure how I'm going to just be able to kind of do this well. And his question to me is the question that I want to offer to you this morning because I've been thinking about it a lot. And he said, Brian, if you think about maybe being in this for a while, whatever this is, he said, here's a question for you. What rhythms and practices are going to sustain you? What rhythms and practices are going to sustain you so that you can be living and leading out of a place that is centered and rooted? I've been thinking about that. What rhythms and practices are going to sustain me? I wonder about for us. I wonder about for you personally, for your family, for our church. I think one of the things that so many of us have experienced in the last 6 months is this feeling of disconnect. I mean, I've heard that as we've talked, had conversations. I think maybe disconnect from rhythms and routines, disconnect from some important relationships in your life, maybe disconnect from the church, even disconnect from God. And one of the other things that I think has happened over the last 6 months, and I don't know if this is true in your family, it's been true in mine, is that I've learned that just because maybe we're given more space, and that kind of happened in this season, right? Some things opened up and things kind of slowed down. I've realized just because we have more space in our lives doesn't mean that we necessarily fill it up with good things or healthy habits. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to share this with you, but here's my confession, is that I think one of the things that we've found in our own family is how much more attached we've become to our devices, to social media, to Netflix or Disney Plus or Hulu or whatever it is that you use when you binge watch. I've seen it. I've seen it in my whole family. I read research that people in the last 6 months, 3 times, are spending 3 times more the time that they've spent before on social media, on their devices. And one of the questions then for us too, as we think about this season is, I wonder what we might need to disconnect from in order for us to experience a deeper connection with God and with others and with God's work in the world. So there's this feeling of disconnect that we maybe feel that just comes with social distancing and these strange times, but there's also, here's the spin, the question is, but what do we need to disconnect from in order to enter into healthier rhythms and practices that lead us into deeper intimacy with Christ and with each other. That's what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. This is just a 3-sermon series, and we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Mark, and I'm going to give you some snapshots from Mark's Gospel where we're going to look at Jesus and his disciples and this question of what do we see them disconnecting from? What pressures, activities are they disconnecting from in order for them to more intentionally connect with the Father and with each other and with the work that God has given them? Today, then, I want to start with Mark chapter 1, beginning at verse 21 through 39. And we're going to be thinking about the first part of our mission statement. So our mission statement is connecting with God, others, and the world. We're going to take each of those each week. But this morning, as we think about, again, what do we need to disconnect from to enter into healthier practices and rhythms, the question is the focus is, how can we experience deeper connection with God today? I'm going to be reading then from the NRSV, and you're welcome to follow along in whatever Bible you may have with you. This is the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, beginning at verse 21. They went to Capernaum, they being Jesus and the disciples. And when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered into the synagogue, and he taught. And they, being the people gathered in the synagogue that day, they were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent. Come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this new teaching with authority? For he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Now, as soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. Jesus came and took her by the hand, and he lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and he went out to a deserted place. And there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. And when they found him, they came to him, and they said, "Everyone is searching for you." But Jesus answered them, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. This is the word of the Lord. So this is one of the few places in the Gospels, at least that I'm aware of, where we are given a picture into a day in the life of Jesus. And this is on the Sabbath. So for the Jews, Sabbath was evening on Friday, sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. So for us, it's like for us on Sunday. They're in Capernaum, which was an important town in terms of Jesus' ministry. It's one of the places where he launches his public ministry. A lot of important things are going to happen in Capernaum. And on this particular Sabbath, on that Saturday, they're in worship like we are today. And Jesus is up and he's teaching. And suddenly, a man stands up and interrupts him. possessed by a demon. The demon screams out, "I know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth, the Holy One of God." It's interesting in Mark's Gospels, we're not going to go there today, but it's the demons who recognize who Jesus is, and Jesus is constantly telling them to keep it quiet, at least at first. Jesus casts out the demon, finishes his teaching, they get done with church, or synagogue, and he goes over to Simon and Andrew's house for lunch, for Sunday lunch. And James and John join him, but it's not downtime for Jesus. He ends up doing some pastoral care as Simon Andrew's mother-in-law is sick, and she's very ill, so Jesus heals her. She gets up, and she's better, and she kind of helps them and serves them, and they all spend some time together. But then, later into the afternoon, suddenly there's a knock at the door, and Mark tells us that the whole town had gathered at the door, bringing all of their sick and those who were possessed by demons to Jesus. Now, Mark's exaggerating a bit. The point is that there were tons of people who gathered who wanted a piece of Jesus, who wanted to experience that divine power, that authority that he had to heal. And Jesus heals them. In fact, he heals them way late into the night. And one of the things and that's just one day, by the way. So there's your Sunday for Jesus. And one of the things that I think is remarkable about this is that with everything that Jesus has going on that day, and with all of the demands upon him and the pressure around him, that somehow Jesus manages to stay anchored, grounded, centered in who he is and in the mission that God has called him to. And this would be true not just for this one day. We're going to see this throughout the entire Gospel of Mark. As the pressure increases, as things get more challenging, Jesus constantly stays anchored, grounded, and centered in who he is and in the work that God has given him. We don't see him in this instance, and we don't really see him in other instances being driven by his anxiety, highly reactive. He doesn't seem to be irritated and annoyed by the demands that people are placing on him. He doesn't seem to be resentful or like overwhelmed. He seems so focused, so fully present, living his life with purpose. And I want to know, how? Because I so often don't feel that way. How does he do this? Now, I know Jesus is God in the flesh, he's the Son of God, but remember that he's also fully human. And the writer of Hebrews reminds us that we have a Messiah who can sympathize with us in every way in terms of what it means to be human with the exception of sin, which means, at least I take it to say, that Jesus knew what it was like to feel overwhelmed. He knew what it was like to feel the pressure to have to please people, and especially people who are closest to you, to deal with people's expectations. And yet he continues to live his life all the time, so deeply connected with the Father and so focused on his mission. How does he do it? Well, I think that this is the key. This is the clue. It's what Mark says next, and here's really where I want to focus today as we spend some time reflecting together. In chapter 1, verse 35, remember, after that full day of ministry, staying way up late into the night, healing those who were sick and demon-possessed, Mark tells us that in the morning, the next morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and he went out to a deserted place, or a solitary place is another way to define that, a lonely place, and he prayed. He got up while it was still very dark, and he went out to a desert place where he prayed. This would become an intricate part of Jesus' rhythm. This sense of doing that's balanced with being, so that Jesus is always kind of in this rhythm of work and rest, of being able to break away and withdraw and spend time intimately with the Father, knowing that his ministry, his doing, always flows out of his being. Let me say that again, that his doing, his ministry always flows out of his being. Jesus intentionally practiced a desert rhythm where the primary focus of getting away to be with the Father was not to do work for the Father, but simply to enjoy intimacy with the Father. I'm going to invite you today, as we talk this morning, to think about what is your desert rhythm? Or what would it look like for you to take on a desert rhythm? Because if Jesus needed this to sustain him in life and ministry and the things happening around him, then we certainly need this kind of rhythm. If we're not going to burn out, if we're not going to be overwhelmed and exhausted, we need this kind of rhythm. What's your desert rhythm? I think it's going to look different for all of us, but let me just lift up to you in the time that we have together some things that I think we can learn from Jesus' example. There's really 4 questions that I want to explore this morning, and the first is this: when does Jesus go and spend time alone with the Father? Where does he go? What does he do? And why does it matter? So first, the when. And as we talk about this, I want you to be thinking about how does this apply to you right now in whatever season you're in, recognizing that we're all in different seasons right now. But think about for you, what's the application? You know, maybe you're thinking, okay, Brian, as you talk about like this desert rhythm and being able to go and just spend uninterrupted time with God, just spending time enjoying intimacy with the Father, maybe your first kind of pushback this morning is, Brian, do you know how crazy my life is right now? Especially, I think, for those of you who are parenting young kids, like I call that like being in the trenches. And you're thinking, I don't have any time to myself. How could I possibly find time to get to be with God, to have this uninterrupted alone time with God? And I get it. But the question that I wonder is, no matter what season you're in or how busy your life feels right now or how demanding the pressures are around you, I wonder, are our lives any busier or more demanding than Jesus' life was? I mean, he had so many demands, so many pressures, and yet what we see is that Jesus did not wait for things to slow down before he went to spend time with the Father. He didn't wait until his schedule opened up for it or to see where he could fit it in. I think one of the things that we see with Jesus is that this time was so important. He knew that all of his ministry was going to be flowing out of staying connected with the Father, this intimacy with the Father, that this had to be a non-negotiable in his life. Not just fitting it in when it fit in or waiting until things slow down or opened up, but Jesus made time for this, and the time that he did this, he cut out time, he carved out time, the very first thing that he did at the beginning of the day. Now, how many of you are morning people this morning? Or raise your hand. I mean, if this is you're like, Brian, this is the 10:30 service. Like all the morning people were at the 9 o'clock. How many of you really do not like mornings at all? Raise your hand. That's honest. I think it's more important for you today to think about the when doesn't have to be morning for you. Although I do think there is something about starting your day this way. But what I hope is that you would take more responsibility around thinking intentionally about when then, if not the morning for you. Again, how are you going to take responsibility for your schedule? And if this is a highest priority for you, when are you going to have this time just to experience communion with the Father, where you can be alone with God? I think there's something about, though, in the morning getting up, there's something about the first thing that we do, the way that we start our day, that I think shapes the rest of the trajectory of our day. So I confess to you that one of the things that's happened for our family over the last 6 months is that we've realized how much more attached we've gotten to our devices and to social media. And one of the things that I've realized is that when I wake up in the morning, guess what the first thing I do is? I reach for this on my bedstand. And it's become habit for me. And the first thing I do is check my news feeds, any texts, my email, Facebook, Instagram. it's become such a habit for me, and I've been convicted of that. And again, I didn't necessarily say, boy, that's how I want to start my day, but it's a pattern that I've fallen into. So one of the ways that I'm trying to take responsibility for my own desert rhythm right now, one of the things that I've committed to is that the first thing that I do, I'm not going to grab for my phone. In fact, I've decided that I'm not going to begin my day or end my day with my device, with social media. I need a break right now from that, honestly. But what would it look like to begin your day in the Scriptures? Or to begin your day spending time just being still in God's presence in prayer? And to end your day in the Scriptures or with prayer? Jesus knows that the way that we begin our day shapes the way that we show up to the things that happen throughout the rest of the day. And so there was something about being intentional about when getting up, going, and spending time with the Father. I also love just this. I was struck by this while it was still very dark. That struck me because I thought, that's not only literally for Jesus, but I wonder if that could be a metaphor for us, that learning this discipline to spend time with God, that we find ourselves living in a time when it can maybe feel very dark. And just as we don't wait for our schedules to open up or for things to slow down before we begin to cultivate this kind of intimacy with God, this time with God, maybe it's when things feel most dark in our world or most dark in our lives that we most need this discipline of staying connected with God. As we grope through the dark, as we wait in the dark. Jesus was intentional about the when. What about you? Here's the second thing then, the where. It's not just the when, but it's the where. Where does Jesus go to spend this time alone with the Father? Well, he went to a desert place. I told you a moment ago, this is actually the same word that's used for the wilderness when a little bit earlier Jesus was sent out into the wilderness where he was tempted by the devil. But again, it can also be translated as a solitary place or a lonely place. But the key is that it's a place where he's able to disconnect from whatever distracts him in order to be fully present to the Father. To be silent and still. It's not so much about doing. Let me say that again. I think this time alone with God was more about being, just being with God. I wonder if there's a space for you. I think place matters. As you think about this question, where might you be able to do this? Where could be your desert place? I think anywhere can be a desert place so long as it helps us, again, break free from some of the distractions. Maybe for you it's a favorite chair that you have. Or maybe it's a swing outside, or it's a path that you like to walk. Here's my desert place. I had Abby take a picture of this, if you want to put it up there. Right outside my house with my cup of coffee in a swing right in my backyard. It's one of those places. There's something about having a place, I think, that even helps our bodies. We don't even realize this, but our bodies just begin to relax. And our souls quiet down. Where's your quiet place? Where's your desert place where you can intentionally have time just to be with the Father? And then what about the what? I'm going to move a little bit quicker here, more quickly through the rest of these. What about the what? We've got the when and the where. What does Jesus do in this time with the Father? Well, we're told that he prays. And being a good Hebrew, Jesus most likely also engaged the Scriptures, the Torah. As a Hebrew boy, he would have memorized so much of that. The Psalms were super important to Jesus. Again, he probably would have memorized all 150 of them. They were the prayer book of God's people. If you're somebody, by the way, who struggles with prayer, I would commend to you, use the Psalms. In fact, that's part of my own desert rhythm, is every day I spend time reading at least one psalm. Right now, I'm also spending time in the book of Jeremiah and in Ephesians, but the Psalms are such wonderful tools for prayer. Like I said, though, it's more a matter of learning to kind of be present to God and give him full access to your life, to let his will have full scope in your life. This is where the spiritual disciplines come in then. So what are things that we can do in this time alone with God? Well, there are a number of different spiritual disciplines or practices. And if you'd like to learn more about that, we've put some resources together for you on our church website. So go to connectwithtrinity.com, go to the Connect then tab, and on the blog, you'll find several resources that we've posted for you there. But one of them is this document called Developing a Spiritual Workout, which lists a number of different spiritual practices that you may want to take on and give a try. There's a number of things like, meditation, solitude, slowing down, rest, unplugging, discernment, confession and self-examination, hospitality. There's a whole list of things that you can look at with some descriptions. But the two most important spiritual practices, I think, that no matter what our spiritual workout or desert rhythm looks like, somehow I think we need to be including spending time in God's Word and spending time in prayer. Those two things. Jesus says in John 15 that if you're going to abide in me, if you're going to stay connected with me and bear fruit, you've got to be abiding in my word, in my words. So let me ask you again, right? You're doing the work, thinking about your own life. I wonder what spiritual practices God may be inviting you in right now. And it may look different. Again, it may look different depending on what you've been doing, but the question is, what do you need to sustain you right now in this season? How are you spending time in God's Word? How are you growing in your life of prayer? The last question then is the why. So Jesus, he's intentional about when, he's intentional about where he goes, he's intentional about what he does in terms of just spending time with the Father, spending time in the Word and in prayer. And then this question is what we should have started with, and we kind of did. But why is this so important? Why does this matter to find your desert rhythm? Parker Palmer, a writer, puts it this way, and I love this quote. He says, if people skimp on their inner work, their outer work will suffer as well. I want to let that sit with you. If you skimp on your inner work, this important interior work of your relationship with God, if you're not taking responsibility with that and giving attention to it, it will have a negative impact on all of your outer work, your relationships, the actual work you do, your schooling, the way you show up in the rest of your relationships. Jesus knew that if he was going to stay anchored in his identity and calling, that this time of spending uninterrupted time of growing in intimacy with the Father was absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. That otherwise he would give in to the pressure around him. Otherwise he would not be able to be faithful to the work that God had given him. One of my favorite parts in this story that you heard this morning from the Gospel of Mark is that, so you notice that Jesus is spending time in his desert place. And I love this because it's so life. That, he gets there and who comes hunting for him? His disciples. Like, I just imagine Jesus like a parent, the disciples are like kids who have the sixth sense to always know where the parents are, so that even when, as a parent, you try to just kind of have some of your own time, suddenly there your kids show up and they need you again. And I think that that's something of what's going on here, is that Jesus is breaking away, needing this alone time with the Father, and we're told that the disciples come hunting for him. That's the word. I love that. All parents are like nodding their heads. Yep, you know what it's like to be hunted. They're hunting for him. And then they say this, and they're super anxious, by the way. They're all revved up, and they say this. They say, everyone is searching for you, Jesus. Everyone is looking for you, Jesus. Where'd you go? Come, everybody's looking for you. And the Greek word that is translated as searching here shows up at least 10 times in the Gospel of Mark. It's a really important word. And every time it's used in the Gospel of Mark, it carries with it a negative connotation, and it implies manipulation, control, or trying to get someone to bend to your expectations. It's the same word that will be used at the resurrection, at the empty tomb, when the angel says to the disciples, why are you looking, Zeitheim, why are you looking for the risen one among the dead? Why are you trying to fit Jesus into your expectations in your box? He's not here. Do you see what's happening in this moment is the disciples come and they're saying, everybody's looking for you. Everybody has these expectations for you, Jesus. And who were those who had the greatest expectations for Jesus? It was his friends and his family. It was those people who were closest to him who put the most pressure on him. And it's hardest to define ourselves against those whom we're most afraid to disappoint. And yet Jesus does this. Mark tells us as much, that they're saying, come back to Capernaum. Everybody wants you back here. They be the Messiah that they want you to be. And I believe that it's because of the time spent with the Father that Jesus is able to define himself, to be anchored in his identity and calling. And what does he say to his disciples? He disappoints them. And he says to them, we've got to go on to the next town. Because I've been called to preach the message that the Father has given me in that place. And this is the work that the Father has given me to do. Jesus was able to be anchored and centered and rooted amongst all the pressures and challenges to know who he was and the work that God had given him because he had this desert rhythm where he was regularly spending time with the Father, letting the Father speak truth over his life, remind him who he was, and what he was called to do. We all need this. You need this. I need this. Of course, spending time with God, this intentional time with God, is not so that we can compartmentalize it. I'm not talking about that. This isn't just about kind of having like a perfunctory time of devotion so you can check it off the list. It's not so that we can kind of keep God just kind of compartmentalized in this part of our life and then we live the rest of our life doing our own thing. Jesus understood that you need intentional time with God to be growing in your relationship with the Father so that you can live every aspect of your life with an increased awareness of God's presence. So that you can be aware of God's presence and power in your life every time, all the time, everywhere you go, whoever you're with. But we can't do that without intentional time that's devoted to just spending time growing in that relationship with God. So here's one of my deep convictions right now. And this has been true for me. This has always been true for me, that I think that the only way that we can truly grow as disciples is if each of us are taking personal responsibility for our relationship with Christ and for growing into the image of Jesus. But I believe that all the more right now in this season. I'm going to say this as pastorally but as firmly as I can to you. It is no one else's responsibility for you to be connected with God and be growing in your relationship with Christ. It is no one else's responsibility except yours. It's not your spouse's. It's not your parents. It's not your friends. It's not your pastors. It's not the church's. Part of growing emotionally and spiritually mature is when we say, I am taking this responsibility. I'm taking this on. I've heard Michelle Christie say before, and I think she quoted William Barclay, who was a biblical commentator, saying that too many of us are still dependent on experiencing the second-hand faith of others rather than experiencing the first-hand discovery of our own relationship with Christ. I really like that. I'm going to say it again. Too many of us are dependent upon experiencing the second-hand faith of others. In other words, Rick, you keep growing in your relationship with God, and then you feed me. I'm just going to be around you, and you do the work in your life, and then I'll just kind of maybe try to get it by osmosis. Where, yes, faith is communal, but too many of us are dependent upon the faith of others rather than stepping in and experiencing a first-hand discovery of an intimate relationship with Jesus, of loving union with Christ. And I wonder how God is calling you in this time to take responsibility for that. I can't do that for you. I can only invite you into these opportunities. So 2 questions for you this morning then, as we wrap up and get ready to come to the table. And I don't want you to hear this conversation with guilt, by the way. I think For too many of us, guilt gets in the way. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this invitation that God has given you right now to grow in your intimacy, your relationship with Christ. And I'm asking you, how will you be intentional around developing your own desert rhythm in order to do this? So here's the two questions that I have for you. What will you disconnect from over the next 21 days, for the duration of this sermon series? For the next 21 days, I'm asking you this morning to take this on. What will you disconnect from right now that's maybe getting in the way of your connection with God and others? Maybe that's limiting your social media. Maybe it's putting more limits around technology. I'm not going to tell you what that needs to be for you. You have to discern that. But what are you willing to disconnect from? Talk about this over lunch today as a family or with your friends. And then secondly, what spiritual practices will you take on right now in order to find your own desert rhythm? Again, it's got to be your own. It doesn't have to be the same as mine or your spouse's or your friends. But what practices, and maybe start small. Maybe just think of a couple. I believe that there's power in giving our word publicly to things, so there's no pressure to do this, but I'm going to ask you in a moment if you would raise your hand if you're willing to give your word this morning to taking those two questions out of here this morning and to really figuring out how you're going to answer them and take them on. So if you're willing to say, Brian, over the next 21 days, I'm going to think about and practice what I can disconnect from, and I'm going to take on some spiritual practices to grow in my relationship with God. I want you to raise your hand this morning. You don't have to know what it is yet, but you're saying, I'm willing to take that on. Just go ahead and raise your hand. Again, no pressure. You don't need to feel bad if you don't raise your hand. I think there's something about giving our word. I'm giving my word to this as well. Lord, as we prepare to come to the table this morning, I just keep thinking of your words, Jesus, in John 15, where you say, abide in me, stay connected to me, remain in me, because apart from me, you can do nothing. And it's true. It's true all the time, but I think especially in this weird time that we are right now, Lord, we cannot be sustained through this without experiencing a vital, personal relationship with you. We need community for that too. We'll talk about that next week, but this morning, Lord, we just are wondering, what are you inviting us? What's the invitation today? Not what we need to do to score points with you or to earn your love. You already love us as we are. But what's the invitation? What are you inviting us into so that we might experience greater intimacy with you? Lord, we take some time just to sit with this as we get ready to come to the table together.